The story begins with the kind of morning that seemed, on the surface, ordinary, yet beneath it carried the tension of lives brushing against one another in ways that would soon ignite into something unforgettable. The sun spilled its first golden rays over the sprawling Harrison estate, a place where silence itself seemed expensive, where even the air whispered wealth. Marble steps glowed faintly in the morning light, and the towering columns cast long shadows across the manicured gardens. Inside, the house hummed with quiet activity, the unseen hands that kept perfection running as smoothly as clockwork. Among those hands was Maya Thompson. At 26 years old, she carried herself with a composure that belied her youth. Her grey uniform was neatly pressed, her dark hair swept back in a simple bun that framed her thoughtful eyes. She moved through the halls with quiet precision, every step measured, every task performed with the sort of discipline born not of servitude, but of determination. Maya was not just working to earn a living, she was working to carve a path. Raised in a cramped apartment across town by her grandmother, Maya had learned early that nothing in life came without effort. She had balanced 2 jobs through her teenage years while pursuing her education, nights spent with textbooks spread across kitchen tables while the hum of the city filled the silence outside. Now, with her grandmother's health fragile and bills to pay, the position at the Harrison estate had come as a godsend. But to Maya, it was more than just employment. She viewed every polished surface and neatly arranged flower as a stepping stone toward the brighter future she dreamed of. The Harrison estate was a kingdom of glass, marble, and whispered prestige. Crystal chandeliers caught the light in 1,000 tiny stars. Persian rugs softened footsteps in rooms too grand for daily life. Every chair, every painting, every piece of carved wood carried with it a legacy of wealth that stretched back decades. Yet under the polished veneer, a current of unease ran like a subterranean river. Richard Harrison, the master of the house, was a man of striking presence. At 42, he bore himself with the calm assurance of someone who had built his fortune through discipline and intellect. He had the eyes of a man who had seen both victory and loss, who knew the cost of power but wore it lightly. People trusted him instinctively. His words carried weight not because he forced them to, but because they came with the authority of a man who had earned everything he had. Yet there was something else behind his dark eyes, something that hinted at loneliness, at a part of him that all the wealth in the world couldn't fill. Victoria Harrison, his wife, was every inch the society queen she believed herself to be. Tall, blonde, and graceful, she wore her beauty like armor, polished to perfection and wielded with precision. She was sharp, calculating, and fiercely protective of the world she had constructed for herself. Her life was curated down to the smallest detail: which charity events to attend, which designers to favor, which friends to cultivate, and which rivals to outshine. To Victoria, reputation wasn't just important, it was survival. And she had no intention of allowing anyone, least of all a housekeeper, to threaten the delicate balance she had fought so hard to maintain. Then there was Emma, Richard's 12-year-old daughter from his first marriage. Bright-eyed and endlessly curious, she had the kind of innocence that wealth had not yet corrupted. To Emma, Maya wasn't just the housekeeper. She was the kind woman who listened patiently to piano practice, who helped with stubborn math homework, who always knew how to make the perfect hot chocolate on bad days. Emma trusted Maya in ways children rarely trust adults outside their family, and that bond gave Maya's presence in the household an added layer of importance, though it also fed a quiet storm brewing inside Victoria. From the very first weeks, Victoria had noticed how her husband's gaze lingered a moment too long when Maya entered the room. It wasn't inappropriate. Richard was a man of restraint, but there was warmth in his eyes, a subtle brightness in his tone, a respect he didn't extend to other staff members. Where others received clipped instructions, Maya received questions about her opinions, her thoughts on books, or her perspective on current events. Richard treated her like an equal in small, almost invisible ways. And that, more than anything else, was enough to spark Victoria's jealousy. For Maya, those conversations were a double-edged sword. They filled her with a quiet thrill, the kind of acknowledgement she had rarely known. But they also terrified her. She knew too well how fragile the lines between social classes were, how dangerous it could be for someone like her to be noticed by someone like Richard. She kept her responses polite, brief, always careful not to stray beyond professionalism. But she couldn't control the way her heart sometimes raced when his eyes met hers. Victoria's scrutiny grew sharper with every passing week. Where once she had simply observed, now she began to act. Little comments slipped into conversations, criticisms wrapped in sugary tones. The flowers weren't arranged quite right. The silverware didn't gleam enough. The uniforms looked wrinkled even when they had been pressed that very morning. It was never about the work. It was about control, about reminding Maya that she was nothing more than hired help. Maya endured it all in silence. Years of struggle had taught her resilience, and she refused to let Victoria's venom strip her of her dignity. She bowed her head, apologized when necessary, and doubled her efforts, even when she knew the criticism was baseless. But inside, the weight pressed heavier every day. She could feel the eyes on her constantly, watching, waiting for her to slip. The other staff noticed. Mrs. Chen, the elderly cook who had been with the Harrisons for 15 years, often sighed when Victoria's voice carried through the dining room, muttering under her breath about cruelty disguised as elegance. Thomas, the groundskeeper, offered quiet smiles of encouragement whenever their paths crossed, small gestures that reminded Maya she wasn't entirely alone. Even Emma seemed to sense something, though her young mind couldn't fully understand it. She would cling to Maya's hand a little longer than necessary, or slip into the kitchen just to sit beside her as she worked. The tension reached its peak on a Thursday evening in late September. The Harrisons were hosting a dinner party, one of Victoria's prized events. These nights were showcases, not just meals. They were orchestrations of wealth and status, carefully designed to impress Richard's business associates and their wives. Every detail had to be perfected because for Victoria, perfection wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. Maya had spent the entire day preparing. Silver polished until it gleamed, orchids arranged in tall vases that seemed to breathe life into the mahogany table, linens pressed so crisp they could stand on their own. By the time the guests arrived, the dining room looked like something out of a magazine. Candles flickered in crystal holders, casting warm light across faces painted with wealth and influence. The evening unfolded with an air of effortless sophistication, or so it appeared to the guests. Conversations buzzed around stocks, art auctions, and luxury vacations. Laughter chimed like glass. Maya moved silently through the room, filling glasses, clearing plates, ensuring every detail ran seamlessly. Her uniform was spotless, her hair perfectly pinned, her demeanor calm. To the untrained eye, she was invisible, as all good staff were meant to be. But to Victoria, she was a shadow that refused to disappear. Every movement Maya made seemed like an intrusion. Every glance from Richard felt like a theft. By the time dessert plates were being cleared, the fragile mask Victoria wore had cracked beyond repair. It began with the single word, Maya. Her voice rang through the dining room with the sharpness of glass breaking. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Forks hovered halfway to lips. The silence that fell was so complete it felt as though even the candles had stopped flickering. Maya turned, her heart stumbling in her chest. She had done nothing wrong, she knew she hadn't. But the look on Victoria's face sent a chill down her spine. Slowly, carefully, she set the plate she was holding back onto the table and stepped forward. Victoria's smile was sweet, too sweet, the kind of smile that hides a dagger behind its curve. Come here, please. The word please was a weapon, not a courtesy. Every guest in the room felt it, though none yet understood what was about to unfold. Richard's jaw tightened at the head of the table. He knew that look. He had seen it before. But never like this. Maya obeyed, her footsteps soft against the rug. She could feel every pair of eyes following her, the weight of their curiosity pressing down like lead. This wasn't a private scolding. This was theater. And she was the unwilling star. Ladies and gentlemen, Victoria said, her voice carrying with perfect poise, I believe we're witnessing something quite remarkable tonight. Our help seems to have forgotten her place." The words struck Maya like a slap. Heat rushed to her cheeks, her chest constricting. Forgotten her place? She had done nothing, or absolutely nothing, to warrant this humiliation. Yet she knew better than to protest. In this world, silence was often the only shield she had. Richard spoke, his voice tight. "Victoria." Just her name, but heavy with warning. But Victoria was past warnings. Months of jealousy, fear, and anger had built to this moment. She was determined to make Maya pay for existing in a space Victoria believed belonged to her alone. "No, darling," she said sweetly, eyes never leaving Maya. "I think our guests should see exactly what kind of staff we've been harboring. The kind who forget their station. The kind who think they can dress up and play at being something they're not." Maya's hands trembled at her sides, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "I know my place, Mrs. Harrison. I've never forgotten it." Victoria's laugh was sharp, brittle. "Haven't you? Then why do you walk through my halls as though you belong here? Why do you speak to my husband as though you are equals? Why do you look at this life as though you could ever be part of it?" The questions were daggers, each one cutting deeper than the last. Maya swallowed hard, her dignity fraying under the weight of the accusations. She wanted to scream that she had never crossed a line, that she had worked harder than anyone could imagine just to stand here. But no words came, only silence. In the doorway, Emma appeared, drawn by the raised voices. Her wide eyes darted between her parents and Maya, confusion etched across her face. She had never seen her world fracture like this. Victoria's smile curved sharper. With deliberate slowness, she reached out and grabbed the collar of Maya's uniform. Her manicured fingers tightened. And then, with one vicious pull, the fabric tore. The sound echoed like thunder in the hushed room. Maya gasped, stumbling back, clutching at the shredded edges of her uniform to cover herself. The cotton had split across her shoulder, exposing the simple white camisole beneath. Tears stung her eyes, humiliation burning hotter than fire. But she refused to let them fall. Not yet. Not here. The room had gone silent. Dead silent. Every guest felt the line that had been crossed. Several of the women looked away, shame coloring their faces. The men shifted uncomfortably, unable to reconcile the cruelty they had just witnessed with the elegant hostess they thought they knew. Emma let out a small cry, her child's voice trembling. Mama broke in bar. And then, with the scrape of a chair against marble, Richard Harrison stood. Richard Harrison rose slowly, each movement deliberate, his 6-foot frame casting a long shadow across the dining room. The scrape of the chair against the marble floor cut through the silence like a gunshot. Every eye turned to him, waiting. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint crackle of candle flames. His dark gaze moved from Victoria's flushed face to Maya's torn uniform, then to the guests who sat frozen in their chairs, holding their breath. The weight of his silence pressed down on the room like a storm about to break. "Victoria." One word, spoken with such quiet authority that it echoed louder than any shout. Victoria's victorious smirk faltered. She had expected his silence, perhaps even his complicity. What she saw instead in her husband's eyes chilled her to the core. "What you have just done," Richard said, his voice growing steadier with every syllable, "is unforgivable." The room inhaled as one. Mrs. Patterson's hand flew to her pearls. Mr. Westbrook coughed on his wine. Every guest knew they were witnessing something they should not, but none could tear their eyes away. Victoria's face paled beneath her careful makeup. "Richard, you don't understand." His voice cut through her words like a blade. "You don't understand. Maya Thompson is not just an employee, she is a human being. And tonight, in front of everyone here, you stripped her of the respect and dignity every person deserves." Maya stood frozen, clutching the torn edges of her uniform, tears blurring her vision. She had expected silence. She had expected to be left alone to suffer. But Richard was defending her. His words carried not just protection, but fury, the kind that comes when injustice has been allowed to fester too long. With measured steps, Richard moved around the table until he stood directly before her. He removed his dinner jacket, the kind of perfectly tailored garment that probably cost more than Maya earned in months, and draped it gently over her shoulders. His hands were steady, his touch protective but never overstepping. "I am profoundly sorry," he said softly. His words meant only for her. "No one should ever treat you the way you were treated tonight. Not in my home. Not anywhere." The tears Maya had fought so hard to hold back slipped free. They streaked silently down her cheeks, glistening in the candlelight. But for the first time that evening, they weren't just tears of humiliation. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of something she hadn't felt in months. A justice. Emma stepped further into the room, her small figure trembling. She had never seen adults act like this. The sight of Maya crying cut through her like a blade. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why would Mum do that, Emma?" Richard's voice was firm but tender. "Go back to your room." But Emma didn't move. Her eyes, wide and shimmering, stayed fixed on Maya. "She didn't do anything wrong," the child whispered. "She's nice. She helps me with homework. She makes hot chocolate when I'm sad. She's my friend." The simplicity of her words fell like a hammer in the silence. The truth from the mouth of a child was more damning than anything else that could have been said. Richard turned back toward the guests, his posture straight, his stance protective in front of Maya. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice controlled but brimming with restrained anger, "I must ask you to forgive this unfortunate broken bar interruption. My wife has forgotten herself tonight." Gasps rippled through the room. Victoria's mouth opened and closed, her age sputtering, her carefully constructed image collapsing before her very eyes. She had spent years perfecting the role of elegant hostess, the flawless wife. And now, in a single evening, her husband had torn it all down in front of the very people whose opinions mattered most to her. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice trembling with fury. "How dare you humiliate me in front of our guests for the sake of a broken bar of her?" Richard's gaze hardened. "The only person humiliated tonight is Maya. And the person responsible is you." The words hung in the air, final and damning. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Westbrook cleared his throat. "Perhaps a broken bar, perhaps we should call it a night," he said awkwardly, already tugging his wife's hand as though desperate to escape. But Richard raised his hand. "Before anyone leaves, there is something you all need to know about this young woman whose dignity was just assaulted before your eyes." Maya's heart leapt. "Please, sear a broken bar," she whispered, her voice breaking. She didn't want more attention. She didn't want to be paraded like an exhibit. But Richard's hand on her shoulder was steady, reassuring. His eyes softened as he met hers. "Trust me." Turning back to the room, his voice carried like steel wrapped in velvet. "Maya Thompson is not just a housekeeper. She graduated summa cum laude from community college while supporting herself and caring for her grandmother. She speaks 3 languages fluently. She has already been accepted into the State University's business program for next fall. In the short time she has been in our home, she has shown more grace, intelligence, and true class than some people manage in an entire lifetime." The words landed like thunder. Some guests lowered their eyes in shame, guilty of having sat silent while cruelty unfolded. Mrs. Patterson dabbed at her eyes, her respect for Maya visible in her softened expression. Victoria's face burned crimson. Her chest rose and fell as fury consumed her. "You're defending her over me?" she spat. "Your wife, your family?" "I'm defending what's right," Richard replied firmly. "And that should never be in conflict with family. Not unless family chooses cruelty." The silence that followed was suffocating. The room itself seemed to lean into his words. Emma, her small voice trembling, stepped forward once more. "I don't want Maya to leave," she said softly, but every word was clear. "She's the only one who listens. She makes me feel like I matter." The child's voice, filled with raw honesty, broke whatever fragile control Victoria had left. Her hands shook as she reached for her wine glass, draining it in a single, furious gulp. Her face twisted with rage and humiliation. "You've ruined me," she whispered, the words barely audible. "You've humiliated me in front of everyone." "No, Victoria," Richard said, his tone final, his voice carrying the quiet force of truth. "You did that to yourself." Guests began rising from their seats, murmuring polite goodbyes laced with discomfort. They left in pairs and small groups, their footsteps echoing down the hallways as the grandeur of the evening collapsed into ash. The dinner party that was meant to be Victoria's triumph had become her undoing. Maya stood trembling in the silence that followed, Richard's jacket heavy across her shoulders, his presence a shield she hadn't expected. She wanted to thank him, to speak, to do anything but cry. Yet the tears wouldn't stop. They fell silently, the release of months of tension, fear, and humiliation. Richard turned to her once more, his expression softening. "Go change," he said quietly. "Take the night for yourself. You've done more than anyone should ever have to bear tonight." Maya nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She clutched the jacket around her and hurried from the room, her footsteps quick but her dignity intact. Behind her, Victoria stood trembling with rage, her entire world crumbling while Richard watched in silence, his decision made. Something had shifted tonight, something that could never be undone.